There is a moment, somewhere in every Warhammer 40,000 fan's journey, where they stop and really think about the Adeptus Custodes. Not just acknowledge them as another faction with gold armor and big spears, but actually sit with the question of what they are, what they represent, and then they start pulling on that thread, and the further they pull, the more the picture that forms becomes almost impossible to fully hold in the mind. Because the Custodians are not just powerful warriors. They are not simply Space Marines with a different color scheme and better stats. They are something categorically separate from almost everything else in the Imperium of Man. They exist in a tier of combat capability that very few living beings in the entire galaxy have ever occupied. And yet, they are not the top of that hierarchy either. That gap between what they are and what exists above them is where some of the most fascinating lore in the entire setting quietly lives. So today, that is exactly what we are going to explore. Just how strong are the Custodians? Not in a surface-level way, where we look at a stat sheet and call it done. We are going to trace this from the very beginning, from the first moments of their creation, through the process that builds them, the weapons they carry, the battles they have fought, the enemies they have faced, and the rare occasions where even these golden giants have been made to bleed. We will look at where they sit in the great chain of power that runs from mortal soldiers all the way up to the Primarchs and the Emperor himself. And by the time we are done, you will have a picture so complete that when someone asks you this question at your gaming table, you will be able to answer it properly. Get comfortable. This is going to take a while, and it is absolutely going to be worth it. To start, we need to understand what the Custodians are in the most fundamental sense, because the instinct, when you first encounter them, is to reach for familiar comparisons. They look like Space Marines. They carry weapons that feel like Space Marine weapons. They fight for the Imperium. Surely they are just a premium version of something we already understand. That instinct, while natural, is almost entirely wrong. The Custodians and the Adeptus Astartes come from entirely different design philosophies, created for entirely different purposes, and the gap between them in raw, individual capability is so wide that comparing the two is a bit like comparing a hand-forged katana made by a master swordsmith who spent 40 years on a single blade to a military-grade production sword made to equip 10,000 soldiers by next Tuesday. Both are swords, both cut, but they are not the same thing at all. The Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, are a miracle of industrialized transhuman engineering. The Emperor designed them to be produced at scale. Each chapter maintains 1,000 battle brothers, and across the galaxy there are hundreds of chapters. They were created to take planets, prosecute crusades, hold the line against the endless tide of things that want humanity dead. They are extraordinary soldiers. A Space Marine is faster than any unaugmented human, stronger than a combat servitor, capable of surviving wounds that would kill a dozen ordinary men. In terms of raw combat power, a single Space Marine is worth somewhere in the region of 20 fully trained Imperial Guardsmen in a straight fight. They are, without question, the elite of the Imperium's fighting forces. Or rather, they are the elite of its military forces. Because the Custodians are not a military force. They never were. And that distinction matters enormously. The formal title is the Adeptus Custodes. In the days of the Great Crusade, before the Horus Heresy shattered everything, they were known as the Legio Custodes, the Custodian Guard. And the name tells you something important. A guard, a shield, not a spear aimed outward at the galaxy. A shield held close to protect something irreplaceable, because that is exactly what they were made to be. The Emperor's personal protection. Not the protection of the Imperium's borders, not the protection of its worlds or its citizens. The protection of one single being whose continued existence was considered so vital to humanity's future that the greatest minds in the species were given unlimited resources to create the most capable individual warriors. It was, theoretically, possible to make. Each Custodian, at baseline, is more powerful than virtually any Space Marine, and that is not a slight gap. That is a chasm. The official lore puts it in a way that is almost beautifully brutal in its simplicity. The Custodians are to the Space Marines what the Space Marines are to ordinary soldiers. Think about that. Really let that sit for a moment. A Space Marine looks at an Imperial Guardsman the way a fully realized supernatural apex predator looks at a regular person. Now apply that same ratio upward. That is where the custodians live. In that same relationship of overwhelming superiority, but positioned above the already overwhelming, and yet even this does not fully capture it. Because the Emperor built the Space Marines using Primarch genetic templates, the gene seed organs that give each chapter their unique characteristics, and a relatively standardized process of surgical implantation that, while brutal and dangerous, could be applied to tens of thousands of young men across the galaxy. The custodians were built differently. They were built the way you build something when you only get to make a few of them, and every single one needs to be perfect. This is the foundation of everything we are going to talk about today. Not numbers, not weapons, not battles. The foundation is intention. The Emperor intended the custodians to be individually superior to every other thing his hands could make, short of the Primarchs themselves. And he backed that intention with the full depth of his knowledge, his genetic mastery, and what is described in the lore as techniques drawn from the dread lore of the Dark Age of technology. Knowledge so advanced and so dangerous that even in the 41st millennium, most of it remains incomprehensible to the Imperium's best minds. The result of that intention and that knowledge is what we call the Adeptus Custodes, and understanding how they were made is where we need to start if we want to truly understand how strong they are. If you are watching this right now, drop a comment and tell me where you are in the world and what time it is where you are. I genuinely love knowing where people are tuning in from, whether that is a bedroom in the early hours of the morning, a lunch break somewhere, or a late-night gaming session with some miniatures on the table beside you. And if you haven't already, subscribing genuinely helps this kind of content keep going. It only takes a second, and it means a lot. Section 2. Born of the Emperor's own hand. The creation process. The process of making a Space Marine is already something that sounds like an act of violence done to the human body in the name of war. Young men, typically in their early teens, are selected from their homeworlds. They go through a series of 22 surgical procedures over the course of months or years, during which 19 organs derived from the gene seed of their chapter's Primarch are implanted into their bodies. These organs interact with the host's biology in complex ways. They change bone density, muscle fiber composition, organ function, pain tolerance, sensory capability, healing speed. The survival rate for this process varies by chapter, but is never comfortable. Across all chapters, large numbers of aspirants fail to survive the implantation process. Those who do survive emerge as something genuinely transhuman, physically superior to any normal human in almost every measurable way. This process was designed to be scalable. The gene seed can be harvested from living Astartes and from the bodies of the fallen. It can be cultivated and preserved. It can be implanted into new aspirants by apothecaries following established procedures. Thousands of Space Marines can be created using the same fundamental steps, with variations in the specific gene seed introducing the unique traits of each chapter. The process is never fully safe, but it is reproducible. That reproducibility is what allows the Adeptus Astartes to exist at the scale they do. The Custodians were built using a different approach entirely, and the word approach almost undersells how different it is. Begin with the candidates themselves. Where Space Marine aspirants are typically teenagers, rough and half-wild, selected from death worlds and feudal planets and feral environments where the strong survive, Custodian candidates were chosen from an entirely different pool. The lore describes them as being drawn from the noble houses of Terra, or from similarly elevated origins on Terran soil, not because nobility confers genetic superiority, but because the Emperor had specific standards in mind from the very beginning, and those standards began with the raw material. The initial selection was extraordinarily rigorous, filtering for qualities that the gene crafting process would then have to work with, rather than overcome. Then the process began, and where the Space Marine process takes months or perhaps a few years for the surgical phases, the creation of a custodian is described as taking decades. Some accounts suggest the full transformation requires a significant portion of what most people would consider a lifetime, with multiple phases of alchemical augmentation, genetic refinement, and psychomimetic indoctrination that begin in infancy and do not end until the subject has been fundamentally and completely remade at nearly every biological level. The 8th edition Codex for the Adeptus Custodes states plainly that from those presented as candidates, only a handful survive the grueling genetic enhancements. The mortality rate is not simply high, it is staggering. And this is what makes the Custodians so rare. Space Marines are rare compared to the vast oceans of ordinary soldiers, the Imperium fields. But Custodians are rare compared to Space Marines. At the height of their power during the Great Crusade, the entire Legio Custodes never exceeded 10,000 warriors. That number is so extraordinary in context that it became their defining identity, their honorific, the name by which history knows them. The 10,000, the maximum possible strength of the most powerful individual warriors humanity has ever created. And even achieving and maintaining that number required continuous, painstaking effort sustained over centuries. The reason for this is that each custodian is not simply implanted with a template. Each one is, according to the lore, individually crafted. The Emperor himself is said to have overseen, and in many cases, directly participated in, the creation of each member of his guard. The word that gets used in this context is not manufactured, it is not produced, it is crafted, like a work of art, like something unique that, once made, cannot be exactly reproduced. The Emperor himself stated this explicitly in the lore, saying that each of the 10,000 represents genetic lore acquired over many lifetimes, that each one is a work of art never to be repeated, that he is miserly with their lives, where he would spend others without a second thought. That phrase, a work of art never to be repeated, tells you everything about the difference in philosophy between the Space Marines and the Custodians. A Space Marine is the product of a process, a refined, demanding, dangerous process that produces extraordinary soldiers. A Custodian is the product of the Emperor's personal attention and the full application of his mastery of genetic alchemy, not a process, a calling. In the same way that a master sculptor does not simply run blocks of marble through a machine, the Emperor did not create the Custodians by following a checklist. He made them the way someone makes something they genuinely care about. Now, there is a question that naturally follows from all of this, and it is one the lore deliberately leaves partially unanswered. After the Emperor was interred on the Golden Throne, following the Horus Heresy, who made the new Custodians? The answer is a group known as the Angenetists, specialists who have inherited as much of the Emperor's genetic knowledge as can be preserved and transmitted. But the lore is careful to note that this inherited knowledge is incomplete, imperfect. What took the Emperor direct personal attention cannot be fully replicated by even the most gifted students of his methods. The Angenetists work at a much slower rate than the Emperor ever did, and the implication is that what they produce, while still extraordinary, may not be quite as precisely refined as the original 10,000. The psycho-indoctrination aspect of the creation process is worth dwelling on as well, because physical capability alone does not make a custodian. The mental conditioning they undergo is described as psychomimetic, meaning it does not simply train the mind the way normal military training does. It reshapes it at a fundamental level, instilling not just tactical knowledge, but an entire way of processing reality. A custodian does not simply know how to fight. A custodian's mind has been rebuilt around the concept of protection, assessment of threat, recognition of weakness, and absolute loyalty to the Emperor at a level so deep that it is less a belief and more a component of how they experience existence. They do not choose to be loyal any more than a river chooses to flow downhill. It is simply what they are. The combined result of all of this is a being that occupies a genuinely unique position in the hierarchy of the Imperium's warriors. Physically, they substantially exceed the Adeptus Astartes in almost every area that can be measured. Mentally, they are capable of levels of tactical analysis and situational awareness that leave ordinary Space Marines looking limited. And, in terms of experience and accumulated knowledge, a warrior who has been in continuous service for centuries or millennia, who has spent that entire time in the most rarefied combat training environment in the galaxy, and occasional actual deployment against the galaxy's worst threats, accumulates a kind of battle wisdom that is almost incomparable. This is the being that emerges from the creation process. Not a soldier, not even a superhero version of a soldier. Something closer to a living weapon shaped like a person, but one that retains full consciousness, full agency, and in many recorded cases, a rich and complex inner life marked by loyalty, reflection, and something approaching philosophy. Custodians are known to be learned beings, capable of political thought, historical analysis, and strategic planning at levels that rival the finest minds the Imperium has produced. They are not simply strong, they are complete. And they carry that completeness into war armored in something that deserves its own conversation. Section 3. What lives inside the gold? Physical capabilities and biology. Before we get to the armor and the weapons, it is worth spending real time on what the physical body of a custodian actually is, because the equipment matters, but it matters because of what it amplifies. Understanding what a custodian is capable of without any equipment at all gives you the baseline from which everything else builds. A Space Marine's physical modifications are extensive. The Black Carapace allows their nervous system to directly interface with their power armor, so that the suit moves as naturally as their own body. Their bones are reinforced with a ceramic-like material called osmodula that makes them far denser and harder than human bone. A Space Marine's skeleton can absorb impacts that would shatter steel. Their muscles are enhanced by another organ called the biscopie, which promotes hyper-dense muscle growth beyond anything achievable through ordinary training. A Space Marine in the 41st millennium is strong enough to hurl a normal human across a room without power armor, can run at speeds that approach the limits of human visual tracking, and can go without sleep for extended periods, because their catalepsian node allows them to rest individual hemispheres of their brain in sequence while remaining functionally conscious. A custodian exceeds all of these metrics, substantially. The specific numbers are not always spelled out in the lore, because Warhammer 40,000 tends to deal in impressionistic comparisons rather than precise statistics, but the overall picture is clear from repeated descriptions across dozens of novels, codex entries, and official lore sources. A custodian, without power armor, is stronger than a Space Marine in full power armor. Their reaction times are described as approaching the superhuman, even by the standards of the Adeptus Astartes. Their sensory capabilities are so acute that they can process battlefield information at rates that effectively give them what amounts to enhanced perception of events unfolding around them. Their ability to absorb punishment before being incapacitated is dramatically higher than a Space Marine's, and Space Marines are already legendary for surviving wounds that would kill ordinary soldiers outright. There is a description that appears in multiple lore sources that captures this well. The Custodians are described as being to the Space Marines what the Space Marines are to ordinary human soldiers. We have already mentioned this, but it is worth letting the physical dimension of that comparison really land. A Space Marine can pick up a vehicle. A Custodian can do that harder. A Space Marine can take a round from a heavy bolter and keep fighting. A Custodian can take several and assess the threat while planning the next 15 seconds of the combat. A Space Marine is nearly impossible to kill in a straight fight against most opposition. A Custodian is something that veteran Chaos Space Marines and seasoned alien warriors treat with genuine dread. The stamina of a Custodian deserves particular mention. During the War in the Webway, which we will discuss in detail later, the Custodians fought a continuous campaign against demonic hordes inside the hidden pathways beneath the Imperial Palace. This was not a campaign measured in days. It lasted for an extended period, during which the Custodians fought with almost no rest, cycling through engagements that would have destroyed lesser warriors completely. Accounts of this conflict describe Custodians fighting for weeks on end, sustaining injuries that would incapacitate a Space Marine, and continuing to function and fight with a grim, grinding persistence that had less to do with immunity to pain than it did with the sheer biological resilience built into their bodies. Their pain tolerance is not simply high. Their ability to function through injury is extraordinary enough that accounts mention Custodians still fighting effectively with damage that would be medically terminal for a Space Marine. Their healing is commensurately impressive. The lore does not describe a Custodian's healing as being as fast as a Primarch's near-supernatural regeneration, but it is substantially faster than a Space Marine's, which is already dramatically faster than ordinary human healing. Minor injuries close in hours. More significant wounds that would sideline a Space Marine for days are matters that a Custodian's body handles without breaking stride. The cumulative effect of this healing capability over centuries of combat service, is a body that has repeatedly repaired itself from serious damage and emerged with a biological record of survival that makes each individual custodian more resilient than their unaugmented specs alone would suggest. There is also the question of longevity. Custodians do not age the way ordinary humans age, and they do not age the way Space Marines age either. A Space Marine can serve for over a century before the biological clock begins to catch up. A custodian's lifespan is significantly longer, with veteran custodians in the lore serving for periods measured in multiple centuries, some approaching or exceeding a millennium of active service. This matters enormously to the question of how strong they are, because every additional century of service is another century of accumulated experience, additional refinement of already extraordinary skills, additional battles processed and learned from. A custodian who has been serving for 500 years has had roughly 5 times as long to perfect their craft as one who has been serving for a century, and both of them started from a baseline that already exceeded almost every other warrior in the galaxy. The psychological aspect of their biology is also worth noting. Custodians are not psychic. This is actually one of the more interesting limitations built into them. The Emperor, who is the most powerful psyker in human history, chose not to create psychic custodians. The reasons are never fully explained in the lore, and there is genuine in-universe speculation about why this decision was made. But the practical result is that custodians, despite their extraordinary physical and mental capabilities, cannot use the warp as a source of power. They fight purely on the physical plane, which actually makes them more effective against many of the warp-based threats they face, since they have no psychic presence that demons can latch onto and exploit. They are, in this specific sense, a closed system. What you see is what you get, and what you get is already more than enough to dominate virtually any physical encounter. The mental acuity of a custodian is worth its own discussion. The psychomimetic conditioning they undergo is not simply about loyalty. It installs a mode of conscious processing that makes them extraordinarily effective tactical thinkers. A custodian, walking into a room, does not see a room. They see threat vectors, potential cover positions, structural weaknesses, the positions of every person present categorized by potential threat level, possible lines of retreat and approach, the best positions from which to mount a defense if one suddenly becomes necessary. This happens automatically, constantly, as a background process, while the custodian is doing whatever they are consciously attending to, which might be a conversation about imperial politics or an assessment of the day's schedule. The tactical mind of a custodian is always on, always watching, always ready. This combination of physical superiority, biological endurance, longevity accumulated experience, and tactical intelligence is what makes a custodian what they are, even before we put weapons in their hands and armor on their body. They are the product of everything the Emperor knew about how to make the best possible individual warrior, filtered through a creation process that lasted decades and produced, in each case, something unique, something that cannot be copied, something that, once lost, is genuinely irreplaceable. The Emperor himself said as much. He would lose 1,000 Space Marines before he would lose a single custodian, not because custodians are more loyal, not because the armor is more expensive, because each one is a singular achievement that took the full depth of his knowledge to create, and once gone, that specific configuration of genetic architecture and experience and skill is gone forever. The lore does not record a single instance of an Emperor ever counting the cost of Space Marine lives with that kind of deliberate, measured grief. With the custodians, it is different. That difference begins in the lab and in the gene crafter's workshop. But it is completed on the battlefield, with the weapons of the custodians in their hands and their armor wrapped around them like the faith of 10,000 years made solid. Section 4. The Arsenal of the Emperor's Will. Weapons and Armor. Walk into any space that the Adeptus Custodes use as a gathering place, a transit corridor, a deployment staging area, and the most immediate sensory experience is the gold. Not gold paint, not gold plating over cheaper metal. Actual auramite alloy, an extraordinarily rare material whose exact composition and provenance the Imperium does not fully understand, fashioned into armor by artificers who were among the most skilled weaponsmiths in human history. It catches the light differently than paint does. It has a depth to it, a weight of presence that announces itself to anyone in proximity. And the sheer quality of the craft involved in each custodian's panoply is evident even at a distance. The armor worn by custodians is called custodian armor, and the description of how it is made says as much about the Imperium's priorities as it does about the armor itself. The lore states plainly that custodian armor is produced without any regard for the consumption of resources or the rarity of the components required. To arm and outfit each custodian to the optimum, nothing is spared. In an Imperium where every war effort involves constant calculation about what can be afforded, what resources can be committed, what is worth the investment, this is a remarkable statement. The custodians are armored with the assumption that they are worth whatever it costs, full stop, with no upper limit on that cost. The auramite itself is described as being similar in composition to ceramite, the heat and shock-resistant ceramic synthetic used in all forms of Imperial power armor, but substantially more resilient. It handles the transfer of kinetic energy differently, distributes the force of impacts across its structure more effectively, and provides a level of protection against both ballistic and energy weapons that exceeds what standard ceramite can offer. A custodian's armor is, weight for weight, more effective than the best Astartes plate. But protection is only part of what the armor provides. Each suit is uniquely fitted to its wearer, built and calibrated to the specific body proportions, movement patterns, and fighting style of the individual custodian who will wear it. This means that the articulation of a custodian's armor, the way it moves with the body inside it, the range of motion it allows, the speed with which it responds to the wearer's movements, is superior to the more standardized fittings of Astartes power armor. A custodian in full plate can move with a speed and fluency that, combined with their already superhuman natural capability, makes them something genuinely alarming to watch in action. The armor does not constrain them, it extends them. Some custodians wear the Alarus pattern Terminator armor, which is essentially the pinnacle of what Terminator-class wargear can be. Where the Terminator armor worn by Space Marine veterans is already an almost legendary piece of equipment, the Alarus pattern is described as a marvel of craftsmanship, driven by magnetomic generator shrines and articulated with Leonis-class actuators, fashioned from layered auramite and adamantium. The individual cost of a single suit of Alarus armor is described as being measurable in worlds, meaning that the material value of the plate worn by a single Alarus custodian is comparable to the gross resources of an entire planet. This is not metaphor. This is the Imperium being completely literal about the value it places on its most elite warriors and their equipment. Now let us talk about the weapons, because the weapons are where the custodians' identity as warriors really becomes concrete. The signature weapon of the Adeptus Custodes is the Guardian Spear. It has been their defining armament since the Unification Wars, when the first custodians were created, and it remains so in the 41st millennium, which says something about how effective the original design was. The Guardian Spear is a halberd-like power weapon, and to call it simply a polearm is to dramatically undersell it. The power field surrounding its blade is capable of cutting through a Chaos Space Marine in half in a single strike. This is not hyperbole on the Imperium's part. A Chaos Space Marine wears their own power armor, often marks of armor that are ancient and have been reinforced and warped by the powers of chaos into something even more formidable than their original configuration. The fact that a Guardian Spear's power field can cleave through this armor the way a hot blade passes through something soft tells you something significant about the force that custodians can put behind a strike. But the spear also has another component that makes it uniquely effective in the complex engagements the custodians fight. Integrated into the head of the weapon is a bolter, specifically a highly advanced integrated bolt weapon that fires at targets up to middle range. This means a custodian carrying a Guardian Spear is simultaneously a close combat specialist capable of cutting down armored targets with their power blade, and a ranged combatant capable of putting highly accurate bolt rounds into targets before they get to melee range. The fighting style this enables is not simply a Space Marine holding both a bolter and a sword. It is something more fluid and more dangerous, a style where the weapon can be instantly transitioned between range and melee based on whatever the situation demands. Without the custodian ever having to reach for a secondary weapon or change their grip. The Guardian Spear is described as being so heavy that it would take several ordinary humans working together to simply lift one. A Custodian wields it with one hand and spins it in great arcs that carry its power field edge through multiple enemies in single sweeping passes. There are variations on the Guardian Spear for specific purposes. The Adrasite Spear incorporates an Adrathic Destructor, which is a form of disintegration weapon that breaks down matter at a fundamental level. The Paragon Spear, also called the Eternity Spear, is the most beautifully wrought and destructive version, equipped with a Paragon Bolter and an Eternity Blade tip, and is reserved for the most senior and celebrated shield captains and tribunes. Then there is the Apollonian Spear, the personal weapon of Constantine Valdor himself, the first and greatest of the Custodians. Custodians who specialize in Terminator-class operations carry the Castellan Axe instead, a great power axe that delivers devastating blows and is complemented by a wrist-mounted ballistic grenade launcher that allows the Alarus Custodian to saturate an area with explosive ordnance before closing to melee. The combination of a teleporter embedded in the Alarus armor and this weapon configuration means that these warriors can appear in the most critical point of any engagement with almost no warning and begin reducing it immediately. The Presidium Shield is another piece of Custodian equipment that deserves mention. It is the precursor to the Storm Shields used by some Space Marine veterans, and it substantially exceeds those later derivatives in quality. Forged from nearly indestructible layered ceramite and resilient alloys reinforced with built-in field generators, the Presidium Shield can stop weapon impacts that would breach even Astartes' power armor, and does so while allowing the Custodian behind it to continue fighting with their primary weapon. Custodians who carry both a Sentinel Blade and a Presidium Shield are simultaneously among the most well-armored and most aggressively armed warriors in the Imperium. The Virtus Praetors, who operate on Dawn Eagle-patterned jet bikes, carry interceptor lances that they use in devastating charging passes through enemy formations. The Dawn Eagle jet bike itself is a purpose-built weapon platform, not a motorcycle with a gun bolted to it, but an agile, high-speed craft equipped with forward-mounted weapons systems and designed to be operated by someone with the reaction times and sensory processing capability of a Custodian. A Virtus Praetor can place precise kill shots against individual targets while traveling at speeds that make normal human visual tracking essentially impossible. And all of this is before we even begin discussing the vehicles that the Custodians can call upon. The grav carriers and grav tanks of the Custodes are similarly extraordinary pieces of technology. Anti-gravity platforms, armed with weapons that exceed the standard loadouts of most Space Marine vehicles, and armored with materials that provide protection beyond what an ordinary tank crew would experience. What this arsenal accomplishes, when it is placed in the hands of beings who have been training with exactly these weapons for decades or centuries, is something that the lore struggles to contain with ordinary military language. The Custodians are not simply well-equipped soldiers. They are warriors who have been made specifically to carry these specific tools, trained with them for longer than most human soldiers have been alive, and conditioned to use them as natural extensions of a fighting style that was itself designed to make the absolute most of every advantage the equipment provides. The result is a warrior who is armored against almost anything, armed with weapons capable of killing almost anything, and trained to use both at a level of skill that most combatants in the galaxy cannot approach even in their best moments. Section 5. The 10,000. Organization, Role, and Purpose. Something interesting happens when you look at how the Custodians organize themselves, because the structure they use tells you as much about their identity as anything else. The Adeptus Astartes organize into chapters of roughly 1,000 warriors, with chapters divided into companies into squads, each with a clearly defined chain of command and a set of codex-mandated doctrines that govern how they fight. There is a reason for this rigidity. You need structure when you are managing thousands of individuals across multiple theaters of operation and trying to ensure that a chapter of Space Marines can function effectively even when half its leadership is dead and the situation has completely departed from the plan. Structure compensates for chaos. The Custodians do not use this kind of structure, not because they are disorganized, but because they do not need that kind of compensatory framework. The fundamental unit of the Custodians is the Shield Company, a formation led by a shield captain that typically includes several squads of Custodian Guard, a Vexillus Praetor carrying one of the great ceremonial standards, a squad of Virtus Praetors on jet bikes, and a squad of Alarus Terminators. Multiple shield companies together form a shield host, led by several shield captains and a council of Vexillus Praetors. These formations are deliberately flexible. The Custodians are not trained to follow a doctrine. They are trained to assess, adapt, and respond to whatever situation they encounter, using the full range of their extraordinary individual capability. Where a Space Marine chapter's effectiveness comes partly from coordinated action enforced by structure and repetition, a Custodian formation's effectiveness comes from 10,000 hours of individual mastery combined with a shared tactical philosophy, so deeply ingrained that coordination happens almost instinctively. Custodians who have never fought together before can fall into a cohesive formation the way water finds its level, because they all operate from the same fundamental understanding of what a given situation demands. Within this broad structure, there are specialized castes that serve specific functions. The Virtus Praetors are the fast attack arm, operating on their Dawn Eagle jet bikes as the reconnaissance and rapid response element of any Custodian force. The Alarus Custodians in their Terminator armor are the siege-breaking element, teleporting into fortified positions and eliminating key targets with brutal efficiency. The Ephoroi are perhaps the most mysterious element, a highly secretive order tasked with counterintelligence, infiltration, assassination, and covert operations. During the Great Crusade, it was said that the Ephoroi effectively commanded the Officio Assassinorum, the Imperium's galaxy-spanning network of professional killers, which tells you something about the scope of their role. The Moritoi deserve special mention because they represent something poignant about the Custodians' relationship with loss and continuation. The Moritoi are Custodians who have been so badly wounded in battle that their bodies cannot be fully restored, and who have therefore been interred in dreadnought chassis to continue their service. They are the smallest caste within the Custodians, because the Custodians make a point of avoiding situations where their warriors are wounded badly enough to require this kind of preservation. But when it does happen, the Custodians honor those warriors with some of the finest dreadnought technology the Imperium can produce. There is also the question of numbers, which connects directly to the question of power. At full strength, the Adeptus Custodes number 10,000 warriors. This was the peak strength achieved during the Great Crusade, and it has been the target number since. After the Horus Heresy, when the War in the Webway reduced the Custodians to a tiny fraction of their original strength, rebuilding to 10,000 took millennia. The 41st millennium sees them nearly at that number again, but it required the continuous effort of the Angenidists, working across thousands of years to accomplish. 10,000 across an imperium of 1,000,000 worlds. The math of this is staggering to contemplate. If the Custodians were spread evenly across the imperium, every single world in the imperium of man could be defended by roughly 1/100th of a Custodian. Obviously, they are not spread evenly. Their role is the protection of Terra, of the imperial palace, and most importantly, of the emperor's physical form interred on the golden throne, which means that the vast majority of them are concentrated on a single world, leaving the rest of the imperium to be protected by forces that, while extraordinary, are categorically less capable. This concentration is a deliberate choice, and it is the right choice given their purpose. 10,000 Custodians spread across the galaxy would be 10,000 drops of water in an ocean of war. 10,000 Custodians concentrated on Terra are an effectively impenetrable shield around the most important thing in the Imperium. But it also means that, for most of the galaxy, for most of its history, the Custodians are a legend rather than a presence. Things that are spoken of in hushed tones and seen, if at all, only in the most dire circumstances. Until recently. Section 6. Blood Games and Eternal Vigil. Training and Readiness. There is a particular detail about how the Custodians maintain their edge that says more about their nature than almost anything else in their lore, and it involves a practice known as the Blood Games. Understanding what the Blood Games are and why they exist tells you something fundamental about how the Custodians think about their mission and about themselves. The premise sounds, at first, relatively straightforward. The Blood Games are military exercises designed to test the defenses of the Imperial Palace by having custodians attempt to infiltrate and penetrate their own security. This is the kind of red team, blue team exercise that competent security organizations run all the time, with one group attacking and another defending. The purpose being to find weaknesses before actual enemies find them. The principle is sensible, but the way the custodians execute it is something else entirely. During the Blood Games, individual custodians are tasked with actually entering the palace as adversaries would, using whatever deception, disguise, misdirection, or direct action they can bring to bear to get through security that other custodians are maintaining. These are not simulations. The custodians are not told the exercise is happening and asked to pretend to be enemies. The infiltrator is genuinely trying to breach the defenses, and the defenders are genuinely trying to stop them. The stakes are real. In the early history of the Blood Games, the cost of failing the infiltration exercise could be severe, and the infiltrators were not simply trying to get past a guard post. They were attempting to get to simulated targets representing the most important protected individuals in the Imperium, including, by extension, the Emperor himself. The sophistication this requires is breathtaking. To successfully run a Blood Game as the infiltrator, a custodian must understand the full depth of Imperial security protocols, must know how to assume false identities, must understand the psychology of everyone they encounter well enough to manipulate them effectively, must plan around contingencies for when their approach is detected, and must do all of this while simultaneously being one of the most physically recognizable warriors in the galaxy at full height and power. Many Blood Games last for extended periods, with the infiltrating custodian spending days or weeks working their way deeper into the palace's defenses, using methods that would do credit to the finest intelligence operatives in the Imperium. The defensive custodians, meanwhile, are not simply standing at their posts, waiting to be deceived. They know an infiltration is coming. They do not know when, from which direction, or with what approach. They know it is a custodian running the game, which means the infiltrator is at least their physical equal and likely smarter and more experienced than any threat the palace would face from ordinary adversaries. This means the defenders have to maintain their standards, not at the level required to stop an ordinary assassin or a skilled chaos agent, but at the level required to stop one of their own. This is a fundamentally different and much higher standard. Between the Horus Heresy and the Indomitus Crusade, when the custodians were largely confined to Terra and rarely deployed off-world, the Blood Games took on additional importance. The custodians had no active campaigns to provide real combat experience. They could not test themselves against actual enemies in the field, so the Blood Games became more extreme. A specialized corps was charged with recovering genuine threats from across the Imperium, including Chaos Space Marines, seasoned mercenaries, alien warriors, and other genuinely dangerous individuals, who were then transported to the Imperial Palace and released into specific sections of it as live opposition for the custodians to engage. This was not a training exercise with safeties in place. These were actual enemy combatants who had every reason to fight as hard as possible, being released into controlled sections of the most heavily guarded facility in human history to serve as live targets for the custodians who were tasked with stopping them. The disproportion of this arrangement, the idea that a Chaos Space Marine in full armor is the appropriate level of challenge for what amounts to a practice run, tells you everything you need to know about where the custodians exist on the power scale. There is a particular recorded instance that illuminates the Blood Games from an unexpected angle. The Primarch Alfarius, the enigmatic master of the Alpha Legion, who was known for his extraordinary capacity for subtlety and deception, once successfully infiltrated the Imperial Palace during the Great Crusade by assuming the identity of a custodian and navigating the palace's security for long enough to theoretically compromise a defense turret system. This feat is considered so remarkable that it is cited as one of the inspirations for the formal institution of the Blood Games. The idea being that if Alfarius could do it, then the custodians needed a systematic program to ensure they were maintaining the level of vigilance required to detect even that kind of attack. The fact that a Primarch's extraordinary infiltration became the inspiration for the custodians' baseline training standard is a telling measure of what the custodians considered adequate readiness. Beyond the Blood Games, the daily routine of a custodian is one of continuous refinement. They spend their time between deployments in practice, in study, in discussion of strategy and philosophy, in the maintenance of their equipment to standards that would horrify most tech priests, with the intimacy and personalism of the approach, and in the quiet, eternal observation that is the fundamental nature of their role. A custodian on guard does not simply stand at their post, they watch. Constantly, with the full analytical capacity of a mind built for threat detection and pattern recognition, they watch everything that happens around them and around the person or position they protect. Centuries of this kind of watchfulness accumulate into a kind of perception that is almost beyond description. Veteran custodians who have been in continuous service for multiple centuries have watched so many people, in so many contexts, in so many situations, that they can read a room the way a skilled musician reads a score. The tell of someone with something to hide, the micro-expression that indicates stress, the body language of someone approaching with intent, the shape of a potential ambush in a crowd. All of this becomes immediately apparent to a custodian with long experience, without conscious effort, the way reading becomes effortless for someone who has done it for decades. This combination of physical training, tactical conditioning, cognitive vigilance, and the kind of accumulated wisdom that only genuine longevity allows is what makes a custodian formidable in contexts far beyond the battlefield. They are not simply dangerous when the fighting starts. They are the reason the fighting never gets to start in the first place, for most of the threats aimed at what they protect. Section 7. The Webway War, Holding the Line Against Daemons. If you want to understand the custodians at the absolute limit of what they are capable of sustaining, the war in the Webway is the story you need to know. It is one of the most brutal and extraordinary episodes in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore, and it involves the custodians doing something that should have been impossible, which is fighting to a standstill against essentially unlimited demonic hordes in the most hostile possible environment, while cut off from any possibility of reinforcement or retreat for an extended period that pushed them to the very edge of annihilation. The background requires some setup. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor was not simply commanding the campaign to reunite humanity across the stars. He was also secretly working on something that he believed would give humanity a permanent strategic advantage over the forces of chaos. The plan was to connect Terra, the heart of the Imperium, to the vast extra-dimensional network of tunnels and pathways known as the Webway. The Webway is the Eldar's great infrastructure project, a series of stable passages through the warp that allow travel between its many nodes without the dangers of open warp exposure. If humanity could access the Webway, it could travel between stars without warp drives, without navigators, without the constant danger of demonic incursion during travel. It would, in the Emperor's estimation, eventually allow humanity to leave the warp behind as a method of travel entirely, cutting off one of Chaos's primary vectors for influence over human civilization. The Emperor was using the Golden Throne, a device he himself had built, as the mechanism for stabilizing and expanding human access to the Webway. He sat upon the throne and worked at this project in absolute secrecy, which is why the Great Crusade was commanded by the Primarchs rather than directly by him. He was doing something more important than winning battles, or so he believed. Then Magnus the Red, the psychic Primarch of the Thousand Suns, made a catastrophic mistake. Attempting to warn the Emperor of Horus's treachery through a psychic message so powerful it crossed unimaginable distances, Magnus's working crashed through the dimensional wards the Emperor had placed around the Imperial Palace and around the Golden Throne specifically. The backlash of this collision shattered the containment the Emperor had spent years building. The section of Webway nearest to Terra was breached, and through that breach, the demonic forces of chaos, which had been held at bay by the Emperor's wards, poured through in numbers that defied easy counting. The Emperor had no choice. He had to sit down on the Golden Throne and use its power to hold the breach, preventing it from widening further and letting even more daemons into the Webway. But this meant he could not leave the throne, and it meant the demons already inside the Webway had to be dealt with by someone else. That someone else was the Legio Custodes. The Custodians were sent into the Webway below the Imperial Palace with the Sisters of Silence, the blank warriors whose psychic nullification abilities are anathema to demonic entities, and elements of the Mechanicum. Their mission was to hold a series of defensive positions within the webway, prevent the daemons from reaching Terra itself, and protect the Mechanicum workers who were attempting to repair the breached sections and seal the rifts that were allowing additional demonic entities to pour through. What followed was described by Aaron Dembski-Bowden in the novel Master of Mankind, which focused specifically on this conflict, as one of the most harrowing, sustained engagements in Imperial history. The Custodians found themselves in a trans-dimensional battlefield that was itself being distorted by demonic activity, fighting against entities that could not be killed in any permanent sense, only banished back to the warp, against numbers that replenished faster than they could be reduced, in conditions that were actively hostile to biological life, in ways that went beyond simple environmental danger. The demonic forces included greater daemons, the most powerful individual entities that chaos can manifest in the physical realm, beings that are themselves comparable in raw power to a Primarch or very nearly so. The Custodians held their defensive lines against these beings, not comfortably, not without cost. The losses they sustained during this conflict were catastrophic by any measure. By the time the war in the webway reached its most desperate point, the Custodians had been reduced to approximately 10% of their original strength. From whatever number they began with, somewhere near or approaching 10,000, they were ground down to around 1,000. 3 of the 4 commanding tribunes were killed. The defenders' position in the Impossible City, the beautiful abandoned Eldar settlement at the heart of their defensive perimeter, came under direct threat from a being called Drachnian, a daemon so powerful that even the Custodians could not directly confront it without extraordinary preparation and sacrifice. The fighting within the webway's tunnels involved Custodians killing demons in melee combat at close range, in confined spaces, against things whose very existence warped the physical laws around them, with the knowledge that there was no relief force coming, no retreat available, and no way to truly win in any traditional sense. The only possible victory was holding long enough for the Emperor to stabilize the breach, and they held. Against sustained demonic assault, against greater daemons, against the slow, grinding attrition of an enemy that could not be permanently killed and that never slept and that felt no fear and experienced no demoralization, against an environment that was actively trying to destroy them on a level that went beyond ordinary environmental hazard. They held until the Emperor could reinforce the wards. They held until the breach was stabilized. They held at the cost of 9,000 of their 10,000, with a tenacity that has no simple explanation beyond the nature of what they were made to be. The ability to fight in that environment, at that tempo, for that long, against those enemies, and still function, still hold defensive lines, still execute tactical maneuvers, still make command decisions under conditions of extraordinary stress and catastrophic loss, is perhaps the clearest and most complete demonstration of what the Custodians are capable of sustaining. This was not a battle they won by superior individual combat power alone, though that power was essential. It was a battle they won by refusing to break when every rational calculation said breaking was inevitable. After the Horus Heresy, after the Emperor was interred on the Golden Throne, the Custodians wore black cloaks over their armor for millennia, a sign of mourning, a sign of shame for the one failure they would never forgive themselves for. The moment when Horus's forces breached the Eternity Gate during the Siege of Terra, when despite everything, the walls had been touched. They did not remove those cloaks until Robut Guilliman returned at the end of the 41st millennium and, in effect, told them that the Imperium needed them too badly for them to keep carrying that shame in a way that held them back. That the Custodians wore mourning for 10,000 years over a failure that, by any objective measure, most defenders could not have prevented, tells you as much about their character as the war in the webway tells you about their capability. Section 8. Against Primarchs and Greater Threats, where the power ceiling is. We have established that the Custodians are individually superior to Space Marines in essentially every meaningful way. We have seen them hold their own against demonic hordes that would have annihilated any lesser force. We have looked at the quality of their weapons and armor, the depth of their training, the extraordinary physical capabilities built into their biology. Now we need to talk about where their limits actually are. Because understanding a warrior means understanding not just what they can do, but where they reach the edge of what they can do. The clearest upper boundary in the Custodians' power is the Primarchs. This comparison appears repeatedly in the lore, stated explicitly, in ways that are too consistent to be accidental. The Custodians are described as being to the Space Marines as the Emperor is to the Primarchs. The Primarchs are to the Custodians what the Custodians are to Space Marines, which means that the same ratio of dominance that Custodians hold over Astartes, the Primarchs hold over Custodians. This is not a small gap. We have already established that the gap between a Custodian and a Space Marine is enormous. Applying that same ratio to the relationship between Primarchs and Custodians puts Primarchs in a category that feels almost mythological by comparison to even the Custodians' extraordinary power. And there is plenty of lore evidence to support this hierarchy. During the Battle of Prospero, when the Emperor sent Constantine Valdor and a force of Custodians alongside Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to confront Magnus the Red on his homeworld of Prospero, the Custodians were overwhelmed by Magnus's psychic power. A psyker of Magnus's caliber, operating with the full force of his Primarch-level abilities and the decades of accumulated psychic training that had made him the greatest human sorcerer in history, was simply beyond what the Custodians could counter with physical force alone. The Sisters of Silence, with their psychic nullification capabilities, were essential to making that campaign survivable, because without them, the Custodians' physical excellence was simply not the relevant factor in a fight against a being of that psychic magnitude. During the Siege of Terra, Custodian squads that encountered Daemon Primarchs who had merged with the power of their patron Chaos Gods and become something beyond even the already extraordinary baseline of a Primarch, were described as being overwhelmed and killed. Not beaten after a long struggle, not repelled at great cost, killed in engagements where the power differential was so extreme that even the Custodians' extraordinary capability could not bridge it. The lore attempts to quantify the gap in a few places. One of the more striking suggestions is that it would take somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 Custodians working in perfect coordination to have a realistic chance of engaging a Primarch and achieving a meaningful result. Other discussions put the number higher, especially for the more physically dominant Primarchs, like Ferrus Manus, whose strength and durability in particular were described as being so extreme that even by Primarch standards, he was exceptional. The Emperor himself, when planning the censure force against Lorgar before the heresy, assigned 20 Custodians to watch the Wordbearer's Primarch, suggesting that in his calculation, this number was adequate to handle one of the less physically imposing Primarchs if things went badly. This framing, 20 of the most powerful individual warriors humans have ever created as a contingency force against a single one of his sons, tells you both how powerful the Custodians are and how far above them the Primarchs sit simultaneously. Greater demons represent a somewhat more complex comparison. A greater daemon, a being like a bloodthirster of Khorne or a lord of change of Tzientch, manifests at a level of power that is individually comparable to or approaching a Primarch. The Custodians encountered these beings during the War in the Webway and during the Siege of Terra, and the record is mixed. Individual Custodians were killed by greater daemons. Squads of Custodians working together could engage and banish greater daemons at great cost. The Sister of Silence working alongside the Custodians were crucial for suppressing the psychic and supernatural abilities that greater daemons deploy in concert with their physical power, because without that suppression, the gap was often too wide for even Custodians to bridge. What this tells us is that the Custodians sit in a genuine intermediate tier between the extraordinary and the truly transcendent. Above Space Marines by the same margin that Space Marines exceed ordinary soldiers. Below Primarchs by a similar margin. This places them in a very specific band of capability that is, for most practical purposes, effectively unlimited in terms of what it can achieve against ordinary opposition, and genuinely dangerous even against truly extraordinary opposition when fighting in the right conditions and with the right support. There is also the question of what pure numbers do for the Custodians. 10 Custodians working together can achieve things that 50 Space Marines cannot. 100 Custodians in coordinated action represent a force that very little in the galaxy can directly oppose. The Battle of Lionsgate, which we will discuss later, saw the Custodians defending Terra against a Khornate demonic invasion alongside Guilliman's Ultramarines, and their performance in that engagement demonstrated that at full scale, the Custodians can punch well above their individual capability through coordination and strategic application of their extraordinary individual power. The key insight about where the Custodians' power ceiling is can be summarized this way. They are the most capable individual warriors humanity has ever produced, operating just below the tier of truly cosmic power, where Primarchs and Greater Daemons and equivalent beings exist. In terms of practical battlefield impact, this means they can destroy almost any threat that does not rise to that cosmic tier. Against those threats, they require coordination, numbers, supporting elements, and, ideally, circumstances that limit their opponent's ability to use their most dangerous capabilities. They are not invincible. Nothing in Warhammer 40,000 is invincible, but they are the closest thing humanity has to a guaranteed answer for any challenge below the very highest tier of what the setting contains. Section 9. The Legends. Constantine Valdor and Trajan Valoris. Within an organization that is itself the pinnacle of human martial achievement, there are individuals who stand above their already extraordinary peers. The position of Captain General has been held by 17 individuals in the millennia since the Horus Heresy, and the role requires a warrior prowess that approaches that of the Primarchs of old. Each of the 17 individuals who have held this title was considered the greatest warrior in the Adeptus Custodes at the time they assumed it, meaning that each of them was, by extension, potentially the greatest human warrior in the Imperium in their era. Two of these figures stand out, particularly in the historical record. The first is Constantine Valdor, the very first Captain General, who served from the earliest days of the Unification Wars through the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy before mysteriously disappearing, his fate unknown even to his closest comrades. The second is Trajan Valoris, the current Captain General, the 17th to hold the title, who is considered by many to be the greatest warrior to hold that position since Valdor himself. Constantine Valdor deserves to be spoken of with the kind of reverence that the lore itself extends to him, because he was not simply the first Captain General. He was the one who defined what the role meant, who established the standards that all subsequent Captains General have been measured against, and who served the Emperor with a closeness and trust that placed him alongside Malcador, the Sigillite, as one of the two individuals who knew the Emperor best of anyone who was not a Primarch. Where the Primarchs were made to be the Emperor's sons, his weapons pointed at the galaxy, Valdor was made to be his right hand, the closest and most trusted of his personal guard. Valdor wielded the Apollonian spear, a weapon custom-made for him personally and never replicated, and his combat capabilities in the lore are described as being essentially without peer among the Custodians. His tactical mind was considered one of the finest in the Imperium, and his counsel was sought not simply on matters of security, but on political and strategic questions of the highest order, placing him on the Council of Terra alongside Malcador and the Fabricator General of Mars, and eventually among the first High Lords of the Imperium. He was also present at the Battle of Prospero, commanding Custodians alongside Leman Russ in the censure action against the Thousand Suns, one of the most significant military actions of the Great Crusade era. His disappearance following the Horus Heresy is one of the most tantalizing mysteries in 40,000 lore. He did not die in battle, or at least no record of his death exists. He was among the first High Lords of the Imperium, and then, at some point, he was simply gone. No explanation, no body, no final recorded action. The Watcher's Axe, the great polearm weapon that has been carried by every subsequent Captain General, was forged in the wake of his disappearance, specifically because Valdor's personal weapon went with him wherever he went and was never recovered. The mystery of what happened to Constantine Valdor remains one of the things that the lore has not yet resolved, and whether it ever will remains to be seen. Trajan Valoris, the current Captain General, is a figure of the present rather than the past, and his arc is in some ways defined by the question of what the Custodians should be now in a galaxy that has changed almost unrecognizably from the one they were made for. Valoris has a severely scarred face and a manner that is described as cold and imposing, the external expression of a mind and will that have been honed over centuries of continuous service into something of extraordinary precision. He was originally an Alarus Custodian, the teleporting Terminator armored shock troops, and during that period, he achieved something no other custodian on record has managed. He successfully ran 2 blood games, 2 separate successful infiltrations of the Imperial Palace's defenses. Both times, he got through. The record for a single, successful blood game run was already considered exceptional. 2 stands entirely alone. His rise from that already remarkable beginning continued through centuries of active service, including the destruction of the Space Hulk, known as the Mournful Siren, the elimination of a Genestealer cult, known as the Emperor's Writhing Shadow, and the spearheading of a preemptive strike against a massive greenskin mobilization before it could threaten Imperial worlds. Each of these actions is significant in isolation. Together, they built a record that eventually earned him the elevation to Shield Captain and, ultimately, to Captain General after the death of his predecessor. As Captain General, Valoris has been responsible for one of the most significant shifts in Custodian doctrine in 10,000 years. It was Valoris who, in the aftermath of Guilliman's return and the opening of the Great Rift, determined that the threats to the Imperium were severe enough to warrant deploying the Custodians beyond Terra. For 10,000 years, the Custodians had interpreted their duty as requiring their physical presence near the Emperor at all times, and had maintained this interpretation even as the galaxy burned around them. Valoris looked at what was happening, assessed the strategic picture, and concluded that a wider deployment was necessary, that the best way to protect the Emperor was to prevent the threats that might eventually reach him from ever getting close enough to matter. In combat, Valoris carries the Watcher's Axe, a weapon forged after Valdor's disappearance that has been wielded by every Captain General since. It is a massive power polearm that crackles with golden lightning and is capable of, according to the lore, bisecting the sarcophagus of a Chaos Hellbrute in a single swing. A Hellbrute is a Chaos Space Marine dreadnought, a walking armored war engine that requires weapons of considerable power to damage. That the Watcher's Axe can cut through one in a single blow gives you a sense of the force Valoris can bring to bear. He also carries a mysterious device called the Moment Shackle, an ancient artifact retrieved from a vault deep within Terra, whose exact nature is not fully understood even by the Custodians themselves. Its effect in combat is described as the ability to briefly manipulate the local flow of time, allowing Valoris to react to threats with a speed that exceeds even his already extraordinary natural capability. Whether this device represents technology from the Dark Age, a psychomechanical artifact of some kind, or something stranger still, the lore does not definitively say. What it does say is that its presence makes Valoris even more dangerous than his already exceptional baseline would suggest. At the time of the 13th Black Crusade, Trajan Valoris was assessed in the lore as potentially the deadliest individual warrior in the entire Imperium of Man, with combat prowess approaching that of the Primarchs. Not matching, approaching, which means he sits at the very top of the mortal human tier of combat capability, a hair's breadth below the genuinely transcendent. Section 10, Returning to the Stars. The Custodians in the 41st Millennium. For 10,000 years after the Horus Heresy, the Adeptus Custodes carried something with them that is hard to put into simple terms. They wore it literally for much of that time, in the black cloaks they draped over their golden armor, as a sign of mourning and penance for what they viewed as their ultimate failure. They had been made to protect the Emperor. The Emperor was now imprisoned in a half-death on the Golden Throne, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every single day, unable to speak, unable to act, slowly dying over 10,000 years. By the Custodians' own judgment of their purpose, they had failed at the only thing that truly mattered. This self-imposed burden shaped how they operated for those 10 millennia. They remained on Terra. They guarded the Emperor's physical form on the Golden Throne. They maintained the Imperial Palace's defenses. They ran their blood games to stay sharp. They accepted a smaller and smaller role in the actual governance and defense of the Imperium, ceding authority and influence to the High Lords of Terra, while they retreated into a kind of focused, mournful vigilance that was simultaneously everything they were supposed to be and much less than what the Imperium needed from them. During this period, they were not entirely invisible. There are records of Custodian deployments during significant crises, moments when the threat was so severe or the location so symbolically critical that the Custodians judged their deployment necessary. During the Age of Apostasy, the period of grotesque political and religious corruption associated with the despot Goj van der Rey. Custodians emerged briefly from the imperial palace in an attempt to reach van der Rey, only to be halted by the brides of the emperor, Van Dyer's corrupted bodyguards who had been deceived into serving him. The fact that the Custodians were halted not by superior force, but by the presence of warriors they were unwilling to cut through indiscriminately, shows something important about how they think. They are not simply weapons, they make moral calculations. There are also records of a shield host numbering in the hundreds intercepting and repelling a strike group of Harlequins, the mysterious warrior performers of the Eldar, who are themselves individually comparable to Space Marine veterans in terms of combat capability, during an attempt to breach the Imperial precincts in the 32nd millennium. Hundreds of Custodians dealing with potentially thousands of Harlequins while maintaining the security of the palace is a detail that gets mentioned in passing in the lore, but is remarkable if you understand what Harlequins are. These are Eldar who have trained for centuries in the arts of acrobatic combat, psychic warfare, and reality-bending battlefield tricks, and the Custodians stopped them. But the most dramatic change in the Custodians' role in the 41st millennium began with the events surrounding the resurrection of Robert Guilliman and the opening of the Great Rift. The Great Rift, also known as the Cicatrix Maledictum, is a tear in reality that divided the galaxy into two halves and dramatically increased the presence and activity of chaos across the Imperium. It was accompanied by the near-total collapse of reliable astropathic communication, the darkening of the Astronomicon for a period known as the Noctis Eterna, and a cascade of chaos invasions across hundreds of worlds simultaneously. The Battle of Lion's Gate was the Custodians' most dramatic action during this period. As Robert Guilliman was newly returned to Terra following his resurrection and the campaign that brought him home, the empiric shockwaves from the Great Rift's opening drove a massive horde of cornate daemons through the fabric of reality directly onto Terra itself. This was the nightmare scenario, the thing the Custodians had been positioned to prevent for 10,000 years. An assault on Terra itself, by demonic forces of immense power, coming through a breach in reality rather than through the orbital defenses. The Custodians enacted what are described as their catastrophe protocols, the emergency plans developed and refined over 10 millennia for exactly this kind of scenario, with a calm and self-assurance that, under the circumstances, is almost frightening in its composure. They stormed out of the Imperial Palace to meet the demonic host, fighting alongside Guilliman's Ultramarines and a contingent of the Sisters of Silence. The result was a desperate, brutal engagement that successfully repelled the demonic invasion. This battle had another consequence beyond its immediate military result. It demonstrated to Trajan Valoris and to the Custodians as an organization that waiting inside the palace was no longer sufficient. The Great Rift had changed the strategic situation of the entire Imperium so dramatically that the Custodians' traditional interpretation of their mission needed to change with it. The threats to the Emperor were no longer primarily threats that would come to Terra if allowed to grow unchallenged. The threats were now large enough and numerous enough that some of them were reaching Terra, that Terra itself was a battlefield rather than a fortress inviolate. Under Valoris's direction, the Custodians abandoned their black cloaks of mourning. They put on their golden armor without concealment, and they began to deploy beyond Terra for the first time in 10,000 years in any significant numbers, joining the Indomitus Crusade that Guilliman launched to stabilize and reclaim the Imperium in the aftermath of the Great Rift's opening. The impact of even small numbers of Custodians on the various campaigns of the Indomitus Crusade was significant. A shield captain named Achelor led a Custodian force to the shrine world of Gathalamor in advance of Guilliman's main fleet, providing a crucial first contact assessment and engagement against the forces that had taken the planet. The presence of even a handful of Custodians alongside other Imperial forces dramatically changes what those forces can achieve, both in terms of raw combat capability and in terms of morale. Other Imperial warriors, Space Marines included, fight differently when Custodians are beside them. There is something about the presence of beings who were made by the Emperor's own hand that carries a weight of reassurance beyond anything a strategic briefing can provide. There are now Custodians deployed across the galaxy in a way that has not been seen since the Great Crusade. Their numbers are small, compared to the vast scale of the Imperium's wars, but their impact is disproportionate to their numbers in exactly the way the lore has always suggested it would be. A custodian on a battlefield is not simply one very strong fighter. A custodian on a battlefield is a force multiplier, an anchor point around which other Imperial forces can organize, a signal to enemies that what they are facing is not the normal quality of Imperial resistance. The fact that the Custodians have returned to active deployment across the stars after 10,000 years of self-imposed confinement to Terra represents a fundamental change in the Imperium's strategic picture. It also represents, in a way, a partial answer to the grief they have carried since the heresy. They cannot undo what happened. They cannot restore the Emperor to what he was. But they can fight for the Imperium he built in the way they were always capable of fighting, with the full expression of everything they were made to be. That is not nothing. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where everything is loss and attrition and the grinding horror of unending war, the return of the 10,000 to the stars might be the closest thing to hope that the Imperium has to offer. Closing. The weight of gold. So, just how strong are the Custodians? They are the Emperor's own hand. Made in the full fire of his genetic mastery, each one a unique achievement that cannot be reproduced, trained for decades before they ever set foot on a battlefield, carrying weapons worth more than most planets and armor that shrugs off the firepower that would kill a space marine outright. They are psychologically conditioned at a level so deep that their vigilance and their loyalty are not choices they make. They are simply what these beings are. In practical terms, a single Custodian is capable of engaging and defeating multiple space marines simultaneously. In the broader scale of things, a small Custodian force can hold positions against enemies that would require entire space marine companies to contain. They are limited below the tier of Primarchs and Greater Daemons, where even their extraordinary power reaches a ceiling that requires coordination and support to exceed. But between that ceiling and the vast ocean of ordinary opposition that the galaxy presents, the Custodians are effectively without equal as individual warriors. They have held the line in the webway against demonic hordes that ground them down to 10% strength, and they did not break. They have guarded the Emperor for 10,000 years, through the longest vigil in human history. They have returned to the stars and are now fighting once again for the Imperium that their creator spent everything to build. The question of how strong the Custodians are has a simple answer and a complicated one. The simple answer is stronger than almost anything else humanity has ever produced. The complicated answer is everything we have talked about today. And the full picture of the Adeptus Custodes is, I think, one of the most compelling things in all of Warhammer 40,000. Not just because of what they can do, but because of what they represent. The Emperor's belief that something could be made so good, so complete, so singular, that no threat could reach what it guarded, and the 10,000 years of history that followed, with all its tragedy, and all its persistence, and all its quiet, golden, unwavering devotion to a purpose that never ended, even when it must have felt impossible. That is what the Custodians are. And understanding that makes every battle report, every codex entry, every model in gold armor mean something more. If you made it this far, thank you genuinely for spending time here. If you enjoyed this, and you want more content that goes this deep into the lore of Warhammer 40,000, hitting subscribe is the single most meaningful thing you can do to help more of this get made. And let me know in the comments what you want to explore next, whether that is another faction, a specific character, a battle, an era. I want to know what questions you have, because in this setting, the questions are always worth asking. Until next time, the vigil continues. Supplemental section, Custodians and the Emperor, a relationship like no other. There is a dimension of the Custodians that gets discussed less than their raw combat capability or their armor specifications, and it is arguably the most important one for understanding what they truly are. That dimension is their relationship with the Emperor himself, not a chain of command, not an employment arrangement, something that the lore struggles to put a simple name to because it does not map cleanly onto any conventional category of loyalty or service. The Emperor did not simply order the creation of the Custodians the way a general orders the production of weapons. He made them himself, personally, over a period that stretched across decades of continuous effort. He poured knowledge into each one that had taken him lifetimes to accumulate, genetic lore from the dark age of technology that was considered too dangerous to share with anyone outside his most trusted circle. He said, in the lore's own words, that each of the 10,000 represents genetic lore acquired over many lifetimes, that each one is a work of art never to be repeated, that he is miserly with their lives, where he would spend others without a thought. This is remarkable language from a being who is commanding a galaxy-spanning military campaign, who is simultaneously directing multiple Primarchs across dozens of war zones, who is working on a secret project to reshape humanity's relationship with the warp, who is managing the most complex political entity in human history. And yet, when it comes to the Custodians, he speaks like a craftsman talking about his finest work. He speaks like someone who made something and knows exactly what went into it and understands precisely why it cannot be replaced. The Custodians, for their part, relate to the Emperor not as a god or even as a commander in the conventional sense. They relate to him as the being whose protection is their entire reason for existing, whose physical safety they have been made to guarantee at any cost, including their own lives. But the lore also describes a dimension of genuine affinity between the Emperor and his Custodians that goes beyond simple programming. The Custodians who served during the Great Crusade, who walked beside the Emperor on the greatest military campaigns in human history, who were present at moments of cosmic significance that no one else was privileged to witness, developed something that functions like understanding of the Emperor's mind, his goals, his values, his way of thinking. Constantine Valdor is the clearest example of this. The lore describes him as one of only a handful of beings who truly knew the Emperor, who understood him not just as a master, but as a person. Malcador, the Sigillite, had the most intimate knowledge of the Emperor's inner life. Among the Primarchs, perhaps a few of the most thoughtful and perceptive, like Sanguinius or Guilliman, came close to genuine understanding of what their father was. And then there was Valdor, who occupied a position that was neither son nor subject in the ordinary sense, but something more like the Emperor's closest permanent companion. The one who was always there, the one who saw everything. This relationship matters for the question of strength, because the Custodian's strength is not simply physical or tactical, it is also emotional and existential. A warrior who fights for pay or for orders fights with a certain level of commitment. A warrior who fights for belief, for something genuinely internalized, fights differently. And a warrior who fights for the direct, personal protection of the being who made them, who carries within their body the literal imprint of that being's greatest knowledge and most careful work, fights with something that has no conventional military name. Call it devotion, call it purpose, call it the simplest and most absolute form of loyalty that biology and conditioning and shared history can produce. When the Emperor was placed on the Golden Throne and the Custodians understood that his voice would never again command them directly, they did not disperse. They did not turn their service to someone else. They stayed. They kept their post for 10,000 years, without orders, without any form of external validation or reward or even acknowledgement from the being they served, because that being was effectively incommunicado in a half-death state from which no meaningful message could come. They stayed because their purpose was clear to them in a way that did not require ongoing instruction. They had been made to protect him. He needed protecting. They would do it. The black cloaks of mourning they wore for those 10,000 years were not simply a symbol of grief for his condition. They were a physical expression of the Custodians' own assessment of their performance. They judged themselves to have failed because the Emperor was in the state he was in, and they held themselves responsible for not having prevented it. Even the fact that nothing mortal could have prevented the Horus heresy in the way they imagined it could have been prevented did not move them from this judgment. They set the standard impossibly high and then held themselves to it anyway. This is the character of the Custodians. Not simply powerful, not simply well-trained, not simply well-equipped, defined by a depth of commitment and a severity of self-judgment that has produced, over 10,000 years, a group of beings whose relationship to their own purpose is so total that nothing in the observable universe has managed to break it. They are the Emperors. They have always been the Emperors. They will always be the Emperors. And in Warhammer 40,000, where betrayal and corruption and the slow degradation of loyalty are fundamental features of the setting's tragedy, The Custodians' absolute constancy is perhaps the most quietly remarkable thing about them. Supplemental section: size, presence, and the phenomenon of witnessing a custodian. There is a practical dimension of the custodian's presence that is worth discussing separately from the tactical and biological details, and it concerns the simple experience of seeing one, of being in the same physical space as a custodian. Because the lore spends real time on this, and what it describes is something that goes well beyond the visual fact of a very large person in golden armor. A standard custodian in full armor stands well over 9 feet tall. For reference, an unaugmented human soldier, who is considered impressively tall, might be slightly under 6 feet. A space marine in power armor stands somewhere in the range of 7.5 to 8 feet, depending on the mark of armor and the specifics of the individual. A custodian in their custodian armor, with the additional height of the armor's construction and the way their enhanced frame fills it, is significantly larger than this already intimidating baseline. They are enormous in a way that registers not just visually but physically, as a displacement of space that you feel when one enters a room. But it is not simply the size that affects the people around them. It is the accumulation of signals. The armor itself, auramite in gold, that catches and reflects light in a way that draws the eye involuntarily, crafted to individual specifications with decorative elements that represent centuries of service and achievement, is visually unlike anything else in the Imperium. Space Marine armor is impressive, but recognizable as power armor, as a category of thing that people who live in the Imperium know about. Custodian armor is something else. It is older. It is more. The quality visible even from a distance communicates, to anyone with enough knowledge to parse it, a level of investment and care that has no parallel in anything the Imperium mass produces. Then, there is the bearing. The way a custodian moves and holds themselves is distinct from how even a space marine moves, and the difference is observable. A space marine in power armor is a formidable presence, moving with the fluid confidence of augmented muscle and the weight of ceramite in motion. A custodian moves with something that is harder to name. There is a quality of absolute readiness in the way they occupy space, a sense that every part of their body and attention is simultaneously relaxed and completely prepared, that nothing could happen in their vicinity without being immediately observed and responded to. If you have ever been near someone who is genuinely exceptionally capable in a physical skill, a master athlete or martial artist, and been aware of the difference between how they move and how ordinary people move, that quality is there in a custodian, amplified to a degree that most witnesses find difficult to ignore. The lore records numerous instances of people from ordinary Imperial life, soldiers, officials, nobles, even experienced space marine officers, being visibly affected simply by the presence of custodians. Not threatened, not menaced in any direct way, simply made aware in an immediate and visceral fashion that the being in front of them operates on a different level than anything they have previously encountered. High-ranking Imperials who order Astartes around without second thought find themselves phrasing their interactions with custodians as requests rather than commands. Space Marines who are veterans of 100 campaigns find themselves choosing their words carefully and keeping their movements measured in the presence of custodians. They have no particular reason to be concerned about. This effect is partly explained by the sheer reality of what a custodian is, the physical scale and obvious capability that any competent observer registers immediately. But it is also partly the weight of what they represent. A custodian is the Emperor's personal warrior. They serve no lord, answer to no authority short of the Emperor himself, cannot be commanded by any Primarch or High Lord or planetary governor or chapter master in the galaxy. They are simultaneously the most elite warriors in the Imperium and completely outside every chain of command that everyone else operates within. This structural position, combined with their physical presence, creates a social effect that the lore captures repeatedly. People defer to custodians not because they are ordered to, but because every instinct they have tells them that this is the appropriate response to what is in front of them. The Vexillus Praetor, who carries one of the great ceremonial standards of the custodians into battle, amplifies this effect across an entire battlefield. The vexilla of the Adeptus Custodes are not simply decorative. They are potent symbols that have been present at the most significant events in Imperial history, and their appearance on a battlefield communicates to every friendly force in visual range that the Emperor's own are here. The effect on friendly unit cohesion and morale is described in the lore as significant and immediate. The effect on enemy morale can be equally significant in the opposite direction. This is a form of power that does not appear on a stat sheet, but it is genuinely part of what the Custodians are and what they do. They carry with them the authority and the presence of the being who made them, and that presence is felt even at a distance, even by people who cannot directly see them, simply by knowing that they are nearby. Supplemental section. The Custodians in context, what they mean for the Imperium's future. The return of the Custodians to active deployment across the galaxy in the era following the Great Rift is a change whose full implications have not yet played out in the lore. But thinking through those implications is one of the more interesting exercises you can do if you want to understand how the Custodians fit into the larger picture of where Warhammer 40,000 is going as a setting. For 10,000 years, the galaxy knew the Custodians primarily as a legend, the Golden Warriors of Terra, the Emperor's own, the beings who guarded the Imperial Palace and allowed or denied access to the Golden Throne. Stories about them circulated throughout the Imperium, some accurate and many wildly embellished, but the beings themselves were almost never seen outside the immediate vicinity of Terra. This meant that while the Custodians had an enormous symbolic weight in Imperial culture, they had almost no practical impact on the wars that determined the Imperium's daily survival. Now they are out there. Shield captains and their companies are fighting alongside Imperial forces on worlds across the galaxy. Their presence is no longer a matter of legend and rumor. Custodians are being seen, and fought beside, and fought against, in occasional tragic cases of misidentification or political chaos, by a generation of Imperial citizens and warriors who have never had the reference point of a real Custodian before. The effect of this is difficult to fully calculate, but clearly significant. For the forces of the enemies of mankind, the appearance of Custodians in theaters of operation that previously only involved Space Marines or Guard represents a dramatic escalation of what they need to be prepared for. A Chaos warband that has learned to fight Space Marines, that has developed tactics and weapons suited to breaking through Astartes formations, is not prepared for Custodians. The difference between those two opponents is not minor. It is the kind of difference that requires fundamental rethinking of approach, and in the fast-moving, chaotic environment of the 41st Millennium's wars, that rethinking is a luxury most adversaries do not have time to complete before the Custodians are already upon them. For the Imperium's own forces, the experience of fighting alongside Custodians is described in the lore as transformative in ways that go beyond simple tactical benefit. There is something that happens to a force that has been present when Custodians fight, that has witnessed what they can do, that has been reassured by the knowledge that these beings are on their side. It is not simply that their combat power raises the overall effectiveness of an Imperial force, though it does. It is that their presence communicates something about the Emperor's continued investment in humanity's survival that even 10,000 years of his physical incapacitation have not extinguished. Whether this is strategically sustainable in the long term is a question the lore has not answered. The Custodians are still only 10,000 warriors. The Imperium fights on 1,000,000 worlds. The math will never work in a simple way. But the strategic deployment of a small number of extraordinarily capable and symbolically significant warriors into critical theaters has always been a tool of the Custodians, even when their primary role was the defense of Terra. The difference now is the scale of what is available to them, and the explicit endorsement of Guilliman's authority as Lord Commander for their wider deployment. In the longer arc of 40,000's narrative, the Custodians' return to the stars suggests that the setting is moving toward a period where the Emperor's most elite warriors are once again a visible and active presence across the galaxy, rather than a concentrated guard on a single world. What this ultimately means for where the story goes is something that will unfold over the coming years of releases and publications. But the foundation of it is clear. The Custodians have never been more needed. They have never been more active. And for anyone who wants to understand the full scope of what the Adeptus Custodes are and what they are capable of, there has never been a better time to be paying attention. The 10,000 are awake. The Golden Vigil continues, but now it extends across the stars, rather than through the corridors of a single, impossibly vast palace. And if the lore's portrait of what these warriors are is accurate, the galaxy is about to be reminded what it means to face the Emperor's own wrath, given human form, golden armor, and 10,000 years of accumulated fury in search of an outlet. They are not simply strong, they are the finest thing humanity has ever made in the shape of a warrior, and they are back. Supplemental section: notable engagements and recorded feats. Abstract descriptions of power are useful for establishing the hierarchy, but the most visceral sense of what custodians can actually do comes from looking at specific recorded engagements and documented feats throughout the lore. Some of these appear in the main lore sources. Others are embedded in the broader Horus Heresy novel series or in Codex flavor text. All of them add dimensions to the picture of what these warriors are capable of. During the Battle of Prospero, custodians fighting alongside the Space Wolves faced the defensive forces of the Thousand Sons. The Thousand Sons legionaries, even before their sorcerous corruption became complete, were among the more intellectually formidable forces in the Space Marine legions, known for their psychic capabilities and their tactical intelligence. Against these opponents, in a city-scale urban engagement fought through the beautiful and ornate structures of the Thousand Sons' home city of Tizca, the custodians proved devastatingly effective. Their individual combat superiority over even enhanced and psychically active Space Marine opponents was evident in the casualty exchange rates, and it was the custodians' presence that made the Space Wolves' assault viable against a force that was psychically formidable enough to challenge the Wolves with their abilities alone. Trajan Valoris's role in the pre-Rift period included what the lore describes as the elimination of the Genestealer cult, known as the Emperor's Writhing Shadow. A Genestealer cult, for context, is an organization that can grow to include hundreds of thousands of infected members, with a military capacity that includes Patriarch-level beings of genuine psychic and physical power, Primus commanders of significant tactical ability, and neophyte forces that can overwhelm regular military units through sheer numbers and fanatical aggression. The elimination of an entire such cult, which implies neutralizing the Patriarch, disrupting its military hierarchy, and destroying its capacity for further reproduction, is not a small operation. For Valoris, and whatever force he led to have accomplished, this represents a significant feat of sustained military action against an opponent that many Space Marine chapters would approach with full chapter strength. The destruction of the Space Hulk Mournful Siren is another of Valoris's pre-elevation achievements that is worth noting. A Space Hulk is a mass of fused vessels, typically the size of a small moon, crawling with Tyranid Genestealers in many cases, and other threats in others. Boarding actions against Space Hulks are notoriously dangerous even for Space Marine Terminators, who are the standard option for such engagements. The fact that Valoris was significantly involved in the destruction of the Mournful Siren suggests operations that most forces would not undertake without significant preparation and substantial force commitment. During the War in the Webway, the Custodians fought and banished Greater Daemons, the most powerful demonic entities that chaos can manifest. A Bloodthirster of Khorne, or a Lord of Change of Tzeentch, is a being whose individual combat power is comparable to or approaching that of a Primarch. The fact that Custodians engaging these beings in the tunnels of the Webway, without the support of psychic null fields in many cases, managed to banish rather than simply be killed by them, speaks to a level of combat capability that allows engagement with genuinely transcendent threats, even if it cannot guarantee victory over them without coordination and cost. The Blood Games record for Trajan Valoris, 2 successful infiltrations of the Imperial Palace, is worth revisiting in specific detail. The Imperial Palace is described in the lore as the most heavily defended structure in human history, hardened and expanded over 10,000 years of continuous improvement by some of the finest defensive minds the Imperium has produced, maintained and monitored by 10,000 warriors, each of whom is individually more capable than almost any potential adversary. For a single being to penetrate this defense once is considered an achievement of the highest order. To do it twice means that whatever approach was used the first time was not simply repeated, because the defenders would have learned from the first infiltration. Valoris developed 2 separate successful approaches to defeating the defenses of the most heavily guarded structure in existence. That is a demonstration of cognitive flexibility and operational creativity that goes well beyond what physical capability alone can provide. The siege of Terra itself, which saw the full Custodian force committed to the defense of the Imperial Palace against the traitor legions and their demonic allies, produced countless individual engagements that demonstrate the Custodians at the full expression of their power. Custodian squads held positions against entire companies of Chaos Space Marines. The Eternity Gate, the final interior defense of the Imperial Palace proper, was held by a combination of Custodians, Sisters of Silence, and the surviving Loyalist Space Marines against forces whose numbers were so overwhelming that by any conventional calculation, they should have broken through. The gate held. The Emperor's chambers were not breached. Whatever occurred in the throne room during the Emperor's final confrontation with Horus and the boarding of the Vengeful Spirit, the Custodians performed their duty at the Eternity Gate in a way that, whatever failures they attributed to themselves afterward, preserved the Emperor's person until he could carry out his final action against Horus. The lore also records a detail about the boarding of the Vengeful Spirit that demonstrates the power ceiling clearly. During that action, chaos corruption affected dozens of Custodians who were accompanying the Emperor. The chaos influence was psychic in nature, and it overrode the Custodians' conditioning and turned them against their own companions. The Emperor, rather than fight through them or allow them to continue killing their brothers, killed them. 39 Custodians died to the Emperor's own hand during this event, executed swiftly and with mercy to prevent further fratricidal violence. The fact that this is recorded not as a tactical decision, but as something the Emperor clearly found painful, that he then killed the remaining incapacitated ones with a psychic mercy stroke rather than leave them in agony, is a moment of profound lore significance. Even in the most desperate moment of his confrontation with the greatest evil his creation had produced, the Emperor took time to give his personal guard a death that honored them. These moments and engagements accumulate into a picture that is richer and more textured than any simple hierarchy of power levels can capture. The Custodians are not simply strong in the abstract. They are strong in specific ways, in specific contexts, with specific limitations and specific peaks of achievement that, when you look at them together, tell the story of what these warriors truly are. Supplemental section: Custodians and the Sisters of Silence, the Talons of the Emperor. No discussion of the Custodians' strength is complete without talking about the Sisters of Silence, because the two organizations were designed to work together in a specific and complementary way. And understanding that complementarity adds an important dimension to the full picture of what the Custodians can do and where they cannot go alone. The Sisters of Silence are the Anathema Psychana, an all-female organization of warriors who share a single defining characteristic. They are blanks, or pariahs, individuals who have no presence in the warp whatsoever. Where ordinary humans have a small but real presence in the warp, and psychers have a presence that scales dramatically with their power, blanks have a negative presence, a void in the warp's fabric that actually disrupts the psychic capabilities of those around them. Standing near a blank is deeply uncomfortable for most humans, and produces psychic interference in all but the most powerful psychers. Spending extended time near a very powerful blank, or a group of blanks, can be actively psychologically painful. And for entities whose existence is psychic in nature, meaning daemons, the presence of a blank is the equivalent of antimatter meeting matter, devastating. The Custodians are not psychic. They have no warp presence to speak of. They therefore do not suffer the negative effects that blanks produce in ordinary humans and psychers. They can fight alongside the Sisters of Silence without experiencing the psychic discomfort that makes most warriors less effective in their presence. And the Sisters of Silence, for their part, provide the Custodians with a form of support that no amount of physical capability can replicate: the suppression of the psychic advantages that the Imperium's enemies deploy against them. During the war in the Webway, the Sisters of Silence were essential. Without their presence, the demonic forces the Custodians faced would have had free access to all their psychic capabilities, which include reality warping effects that physical armor and physical weapons cannot directly counter. With the Sisters present, those capabilities were suppressed in their vicinity, reducing demonic opposition to something closer to the purely physical threat that that the Custodians' extraordinary martial ability could directly address. This does not mean the enemies became easy. It means they became the kind of difficult that the Custodians were built to handle. The official name for the combined force of Custodians and Sisters of Silence is the Talons of the Emperor, which is also the name of their joint force organization in more recent lore. The image this name evokes is precise. The right talon and the left talon, each extraordinary in its own right, working together to grip something that neither could hold alone. The Custodians provide the physical combat capability that the Sisters of Silence, who are formidable fighters but not at the individual power level of Custodians, cannot match alone. The Sisters provide the psychic nullification that the Custodians, who are not psychers and carry no warp presence to exploit, cannot replicate. Together, the two forces cover each other's vulnerabilities and amplify each other's strengths in a way that makes the combined unit more capable than either alone could be. This partnership was designed by the Emperor from the beginning, which tells you something about how he thought about the threats his guard would face. He knew that there would be situations where physical power alone was not the answer. He built the Sisters of Silence as the component of his personal forces that addressed the non-physical dimensions of threats, the psychic and demonic capabilities that even the most physically perfect warriors would struggle to handle without support. He made sure the Custodians were psychologically and biologically compatible with operating alongside beings whose blank nature made them anathema to most human warriors. And then he deployed both, together, as the Talons, the complete answer to any threat that might arise in the vicinity of his person or his most important works. Understanding this is part of understanding the Custodians fully. They are extraordinary individually. They are extraordinary in coordinated formation. And they are part of a larger system of complementary forces that, when operating as intended, represents the most complete military and security arrangement the Emperor could design. The fact that this system was tested to its limits and nearly broken during the events of the Horus Heresy does not diminish how sophisticated its design was. It demonstrates, if anything, the magnitude of what the heresy represented as a catastrophe. A betrayal so enormous that it nearly overwhelmed the most sophisticated protective system a being of the Emperor's intelligence and foresight could devise. The Talons of the Emperor are once again operating together in the 42nd millennium. Sisters of Silence accompany Custodian forces in the field. The combination that the Emperor designed 10,000 years ago is functioning again, in a galaxy that needs it more desperately than perhaps it ever has. And if the history of what these forces have accomplished together is any guide, what they can achieve when properly deployed and supported by strategic intelligence and preparation is something the enemies of mankind should find genuinely alarming. Supplemental section. What the Custodians know. Knowledge, history, and secrets. One dimension of the Custodians' power that is easy to overlook in favor of physical statistics is the knowledge they carry. 10,000 years of unbroken service, with Custodians who can live for centuries, serving continuously through multiple eras of imperial history, means that the institutional memory of the Adeptus Custodes is unlike that of any other organization in the Imperium. They were there. For everything. Or at least, some of them were. The Custodians, who served during the Great Crusade, walked beside the Emperor as he broke open the galaxy. They were present at the first contacts with alien civilizations, at the moments when decisions were made about how to handle the disparate human cultures that had evolved across the stars in the Age of Strife. They were in the room for conversations between the Emperor and his Primarchs that determined the fundamental direction of the Imperium's development. They were present at the Council of Nicaea, where the Emperor made his ruling about psyker use in the legions, an event whose consequences rippled forward into the Horus Heresy and through 10,000 years of subsequent history. They saw and heard things that no record, no matter how carefully kept, can fully preserve. The Custodians who survived the Horus Heresy and the War in the Webway and the Siege of Terra then continued to serve. They watched the Imperium of Man emerge from its founding traumas into the long, grinding attrition of the 41st millennium. They observed the development of imperial doctrine, the evolution of the Adeptus Astartes, the slow decline of certain technologies, the rise of the ecclesiarchy, the age of apostasy, the war of the beast, the Damocles Gulf Crusade, thousands upon thousands of years of events that they were physically present for or had direct briefings about from those who were. There is no archive in the Imperium, no matter how well maintained, that can substitute for a being who was actually there. This accumulated knowledge gives the Custodians an analytical capability that goes beyond what their intelligence and conditioning alone would provide. When a Custodian is asked for strategic counsel, they are not simply applying training and cognitive processing to available information. They are drawing on a contextual understanding of how situations like the current one have developed and resolved throughout thousands of years of directly observed history. They can point to precedents. They can identify patterns in how certain types of threats develop over time. They can tell you what the consequences of a given course of action have been historically, not from reading a document, but from either personal experience or from conversations with those who were there. This is part of why the Captain General has traditionally been given a seat among the High Lords of Terra, the governing council of the Imperium. Not simply because the Custodians are militarily significant, though they are, but because the knowledge the Custodians carry about the history of the Imperium, about the Emperor's actual intentions and methods, about the decisions that shaped every major development in Imperial history, makes them invaluable advisors in a system where most other advisors are working from archives and records rather than direct knowledge. The secrets the Custodians carry are an extension of this. The Emperor had many secrets, secrets about his own nature, secrets about the nature of the warp and chaos, secrets about the design of the Primarchs and what he actually intended for humanity's future, secrets about the Webway project and why it mattered so much to him. Some of these secrets were shared with the Custodians by virtue of their proximity to him. They heard things. They observed things. They were trusted with things that could not safely be shared with anyone outside the most intimate circle of his confidence. Much of this knowledge has been lost over 10,000 years, because even Custodians die eventually, and memories fade over centuries in ways that even enhanced biology cannot prevent. But some of it persists. Fragments of understanding that the Custodians carry, sometimes without fully knowing what they mean. Pieces of a picture that, assembled correctly, might say things about the Emperor's actual nature and actual plan that the Imperium's formal religious and political institutions would find deeply challenging. This is a dimension of the Custodians that the lore treats with appropriate mystery. It is not meant to be fully explained, because some of the most important things in Warhammer 40,000 gain their power from remaining partially in shadow. What we know is that the Custodians know more than they say. What we suspect is that what they know, if it could be assembled and properly interpreted, would fundamentally alter how the Imperium understands its own history and its own purpose. What we cannot know, perhaps what the Custodians themselves cannot fully know, is what all of it means. And this, too, is part of what the Custodians are. Not just warriors, not just guards, keepers of the things that cannot be lost, even when those keeping them are not entirely sure what they are keeping. Final reflection: the weight of being chosen. Before we close, there is one more thing worth saying about the Custodians, and it is something the lore captures in a way that is easy to miss if you are primarily focused on the power scaling and the tactical analysis. Being a Custodian is not a comfortable existence, not in the sense of lacking material comfort or physical security. The Custodians are, by every material measure, among the best provided for warriors in the galaxy. No, the discomfort is existential. They were made for a specific purpose, in service to a specific being, and that purpose and that being define everything about them. The Emperor is not dead, but cannot be with them. He is not present, but must be protected. He cannot speak, but must be served. His plan, whatever it was, is either still unfolding in some form, or has been permanently derailed by what happened during the heresy, and the Custodians are not entirely certain which. They are beings of extraordinary capability who have spent 10,000 years largely unable to fully use that capability. They are warriors who have spent 10 millennia waiting, maintaining, watching, holding a vigil for someone who cannot acknowledge the vigil. They have seen the Imperium they were made to protect transform into something the Emperor might or might not have intended, full of religious fervor directed at a being who never wanted worship, full of political corruption and bureaucratic entropy and slowly dying technology, and they have not been able to stop it because the institutional power to stop it has never been theirs to wield. The character that emerges from this situation is, in the lore's better moments, genuinely compelling. Custodians who have thought deeply about what they are and what they do tend toward a philosophical severity that the lore captures well. They are not cynical, because cynicism implies a distance from the thing you are jaded about, and the custodians have no distance from their purpose. It is all they are. But they are lucid about the difficulty of their position in a way that many imperial institutions, locked into self-preserving narratives, cannot be. Trajan Valoris says something in the lore that captures this well. He speaks of the Emperor's realm as a festering ruin of overcrowded worlds drowning in their own ignorance and fear, a tumble-down ghetto burning from end to end with the flames of war. He says those who live in it do not deserve their Emperor. He says they do not deserve the custodians, and then he says that none of that alters the fact that the duty must be done. This is the custodian outlook in its purest form, clear-eyed about the reality, completely committed to the obligation. Not because the reality earns the commitment, but because the commitment was made to the Emperor, not to the Imperium that exists, but to what the Emperor was trying to build, and that commitment does not expire when the circumstances become difficult or the cause becomes less obviously worthy. This is what it means to be chosen. Not for a glorious purpose in a glorious setting, for an absolute purpose in a setting that has become very far from what was intended. And to keep going anyway, in gold armor with a guardian spear, for 10,000 years and counting. That is the custodians. That is how strong they are, and what that strength is for, and what it costs to carry it. Supplemental section: the custodians and the mechanics of fear. There is a specific kind of impact that the custodians have on the battlefield that has nothing to do with their weapons or their armor. It has to do with fear. Not the fear that any powerful warrior produces in enemies who see them and correctly assess the danger. Something more specific. Something that functions at a strategic level rather than a purely tactical one. Consider what it means, from the perspective of an enemy commander, to learn that your force is facing Adeptus Custodes. You are not simply learning that your enemy has committed elite troops to this engagement. You are learning something about what this engagement means to the Imperium. The custodians do not deploy frivolously. They are rare. They are concentrated on Terra. When they appear somewhere in the galaxy, it means someone at a very high level of Imperial authority has made the assessment that this particular situation is critical enough to warrant committing resources that are, by definition, not replaceable and not abundant. The presence of custodians on a battlefield is itself intelligence about how the Imperium assesses the strategic importance of what is at stake. For an enemy who is trying to read the Imperium's intentions and priorities, who is trying to identify the most important targets and the most significant opportunities, the appearance of custodians is a signal that cuts through all the noise of the galaxy's endless conflicts and says, this matters. Whatever is happening here, or whatever is threatened here, is important enough for the Emperor's personal guard to be deployed. That information, purely as strategic signal, is valuable to enemies and terrifying to those who intend to press their advantage, because it means they are being taken very, very seriously. There is also the practical dimension of facing warriors at that level of individual capability when you have been prepared to fight the Adeptus Astartes, a Chaos Space Marine warband that has developed tactics against Space Marine opponents, that has the weapons and the formation and the approach calibrated to defeating Ceramite armored Astartes, is simply not prepared for custodians. The additional speed, the additional durability, the additional combat skill, the superior weapons, the vastly higher individual experience level, these are not factors that can be compensated for by adjusting the same tactical approach that works against Space Marines. They require different thinking, different preparation, and often simply better resources than the enemy has available. The psychological impact of repeatedly encountering an opponent that your prepared approach does not adequately address is significant in itself. Armies that repeatedly fail to stop a specific type of enemy, that find their practiced tactics insufficient, begin to develop a different relationship with that enemy over time. They become more cautious. They invest more resources in preparation before engaging. They talk about past encounters in ways that emphasize the difficulty and the losses. Over time, a reputation builds, and that reputation has its own independent effect on morale and decision-making before a single blow is struck. The The Custodians have had roughly 38 to 40,000 years to build that reputation, if you count from the earliest days of the Unification Wars. Even during the 10,000 years, when they were primarily confined to Terra, their legend persisted. The stories of the 10,000 standing at the Eternity Gate, of their performance in the Webway War, of the role they played in the Great Crusade, circulated through imperial and non-imperial populations alike. Chaos forces that had been defeated by Custodians during those eras passed the experience down through their own twisted versions of oral tradition and coded memory. Alien races that had encountered Custodians during the Great Crusade carried their own assessments of what these golden warriors were capable of. The reputation existed and accumulated even during the long period of relative quiet. Now that reputation is being actively renewed and expanded by real encounters in the current era, and the feedback loop between the Custodians' actual capability and the fear that capability generates is something that makes them more effective than their raw statistics alone would suggest. An enemy that is afraid, that is hesitating, that is spending cognitive resources on dread rather than tactical assessment, is an enemy already operating at a disadvantage. The Custodians arrive with 10,000 years of legend ahead of them, and then they deliver the substance that the legend was built on. This combination of physical superiority, tactical excellence, strategic significance as deployed forces, and the accumulated psychological weight of their reputation, all working together simultaneously, is what makes the Adeptus Custodes a force whose value to the Imperium is genuinely incalculable, not simply because of what they can do in a direct engagement, but because of what they represent and what that representation does to every calculation that every actor in the galaxy has to make about the Imperium and what it is capable of protecting. Supplemental section. A note on what the Custodians cannot do. We have spent a great deal of time on what the Custodians can do, and that is appropriate given the question we are exploring. But intellectual honesty requires spending some time on what they cannot do, because understanding their limitations is as important as understanding their capabilities if you want a complete picture. The most fundamental limitation is simply numerical. There are 10,000 Custodians. The Imperium has 1,000,000 worlds and faces threats on effectively all of them simultaneously. No matter how capable each individual Custodian is, 10,000 beings cannot be everywhere. They cannot defend every important strategic point. They cannot respond to every crisis. They cannot protect every person who might theoretically benefit from their protection. The concentration of their forces on Terra, while strategically correct for their primary mission, means that everywhere else in the galaxy functions without their presence most of the time. The creation bottleneck means this will not change dramatically in the foreseeable future. Making more Custodians is extraordinarily slow. The Anginatists' best efforts, sustained over 10,000 years since the Horus Heresy, have rebuilt the Custodians to approximately their original number after the catastrophic losses of the war in the Webway. That is a reasonable success rate in absolute terms, but still represents a pace of recruitment and creation that cannot come close to keeping up with the rate at which the Imperium needs elite defenders across all its fronts. Simultaneously, the Custodians also lack organic heavy support weapons at the scale that a Space Marine chapter can bring to bear. A chapter has vehicles, it has dreadnoughts, it has dedicated fire support elements. The Custodians have some vehicles and some dreadnought equivalents, but they do not have anything approaching the comprehensive arms of service organization that allows a Space Marine chapter to address any type of tactical problem with appropriate tools. The Custodians are designed to be effective in any context, and they are. But they are not optimized for certain types of large-scale conventional warfare, the way a chapter of Space Marines organized for siege operations or armored assault would be. There is also the question of what happens when Custodians face opponents who exploit their specific vulnerabilities, rather than trying to fight them directly. The Custodians are not psychic. An enemy with powerful psychic capabilities, fighting at range, and using the warp as their primary weapon, presents a challenge that requires the Custodians either to close the distance and engage in melee, which they excel at, but which may not be possible in all circumstances, or to bring the Sisters of Silence to suppress the psychic advantage. Without that suppression, powerful psychers and daemonic entities can cause problems that the Custodians' physical resilience alone cannot fully address. They are also mortal, exceptional in their resilience, capable of surviving wounds that would kill Space Marines, but not immortal. A sufficient concentration of firepower, delivered accurately against a Custodian, can kill them. The high-powered weapons that certain opponents carry, the Inferno cannons of particularly well-armed Chaos forces, the reality-warping weapons of certain Eldar configurations, the devastating biological weapons that Tyrannid Biotitans deploy. These can threaten Custodians in ways that the Custodians' individual excellence cannot always overcome. Against those threats, they fight with everything they have, and they fight better than any other human warrior can, but they are not immune to being overwhelmed by sufficient force. Understanding these limitations is not about diminishing the Custodians. It is about understanding them completely. They are the greatest human warriors the galaxy has ever known. They are limited by the same basic laws that govern everything else in the setting, even if those laws express themselves differently when applied to beings of their extraordinary capability. And knowing where the limits are is part of what allows you to genuinely appreciate how extraordinary it is that they function as well as they do despite those limits. To hold the line for 10,000 years with 10,000 warriors against a galaxy that has been trying to destroy the thing they protect for every moment of those 10,000 years is an achievement that survives all the caveats and qualifications about what they cannot do. What they cannot do is be everywhere. What they can do is be completely and devastatingly effective wherever they actually are. And for the Imperium, that has been enough to sustain the most important single mission in human history across a span of time that staggers the imagination.